One or the other. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 13. You might turn there if you like. And if you don't like, you might think about why you don't want to turn. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 13. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 13. And a passage, again, that's designed, I think, specifically either to comfort or to terrify. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 13. There is no creature hidden from his sight, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of him to whom we must give account. Did you underline that or make note of that somewhere, or did you jot it down? Because you ought to. If you are going to be a follower of Christ, if you call yourself a Christian today, and you're going to be a follower of Christ, then you need to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1. You can fool everyone around you, but you cannot fool God. He sees right into your heart. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7. God says, I don't look at men the way that you do. I look at the heart. And that's where hypocrisy resides. And God sees it, and God knows it. So first and foremost, if you're going to be a Christian, be an honest Christian. If you're going to live a life that doesn't change at all, you know, let's face it, we've all met Christians that said they were a Christian or said they got saved and there didn't seem to be any change in their life at all. You know, the only conclusion that you can come to is, okay, maybe nothing happened. Maybe you're really not a Christian. Maybe you just mouth the words, but there hasn't been any change in your life, because the way the New Testament describes salvation, it describes it as a transformation. A transformation. Once I was that, now I am this. And that transformation is obvious and it's clear for everyone to see. So if you're going to call yourself a Christian, be an honest one. Be an honest and straightforward one that says, yeah, I'm a Christian, and maybe part of that honesty is, yeah, I have struggles with certain things. Nothing wrong with struggling. Struggle is a sign of life. Heck, if you did absolutely nothing in your entire Christian life, I'd really wonder about you. But if you struggle, at least I know you're trying. But if you've got to be a Christian, be an honest one. Secondly, verses 4 to 12, be a fearless Christian. Be a fearless Christian. Now, one of the things that motivates hypocrisy is fear. Maybe it's fear of what others might think or say about us. We get too overly concerned about what someone else might think. Maybe we're in a group of people that we've never met before, and we don't really want to let on that we're a Christian because we're kind of afraid of how that might go over in this group. So maybe I say something like that in this group, and then, you know, maybe people think differently of me, or maybe they don't like me, maybe I don't fit in anymore in this group. So I don't say anything. We're afraid of what others might say about us. That was one of the things that Jesus pointed out about the hypocrisy of the religious leadership of his own day back in chapter 11 and verse 43. He says, you love the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces. They were concerned about how they were perceived by other people. And as Christians, we can be guilty of the same thing. We fear what other people might think about us. Now, these verses here, verses 4 to 12, deal with that fear. And the word afraid or the word fear is used 5 times just in verses 4 to 7. Now, the Bible tells us that we are to fear God. First and foremost, we are to fear God. As a matter of fact, in places like Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7, God's word says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Or how about Proverbs chapter 3, verse 7, do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. Or Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. So fearing God is the beginning of both knowledge and wisdom. And there's a difference between fearing God and being afraid of God. And the fear that is spoken of here is that healthy respect, that reverence, that awe of who God is and what He has done. It's one thing that I think is lacking largely in a lot of Christian lives, is that kind of fear of God, that awe, that reverence, that respect, that acknowledgement of who it is that we're dealing with. God's not just our buddy in heaven. He's God. He's the creator of the entire universe. So it's a healthy respect of who He is. Not the same of being afraid of Him. That kind of fear, being afraid of God, that's reserved for the unbeliever. The unbeliever is and will be afraid of God. Because as Hebrews chapter 10 verse 31 says, it's a fearful, or another translation says a dreadful thing, to fall into the hands of the living God. To be able to stand before God on the day of judgment and realize that you'd spent your entire life rejecting Him. That you were wrong. And now it's too late. That's a fearful and a dreadful thing. Or what I believe is the greatest fear of the atheist, and that is that they are wrong. You know, I just got this theory that at some point or the other in the life of every atheist, you lay your head on your pillow at night and you think, maybe I'm wrong. Because part of the Christian life is to lay your head on your pillow at night and think that maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I have believed in vain. Maybe this isn't true. And if you've never had that doubt as a believer, then I don't think you've been a believer very long. Every believer is going to have that thought at one point or the other. Yet fear in general, and specifically fear of others, can paralyze us in our Christian life. It can paralyze us as a believer, paralyze our witness, our testimony to other people. And sometimes, if you've joined us this morning and you're not a Christian, sometimes that's the thing that you see in Christians that you don't like. Matter of fact, I brought this up here recently, that I was reading an article online by a very well-known atheist. And one of the things that he mentioned was that he fully expects Christians to try to convert him. As a matter of fact, he says he has less respect for a Christian that doesn't try to convert him. Because he says, if they believe what they say they believe, they're going to try to convert me. And I would be disappointed with them if they didn't, think that they're hypocrites if they don't. And I thought, you know what? That is a really honest evaluation of Christians coming from an atheist. You know, when people say, well, you know, I don't like to be preached at. I'm not preaching at you. You just preached at me when you told me you didn't like to be preached at. Now you're preaching at me. Don't preach at me. Hey, that's preaching. You're preaching at me. I don't like when you ram your beliefs down my throat. You just rammed your belief down my throat. How does that work? So, there's a twofold approach here, then, to the fear of men. First, in verses 4 to 7, is the fear of what others might think of us or do to us. Okay? Already mentioned that briefly. We fear our reputations, maybe at work. Let me ask you this. Your workplace, all the people that you work with, how many of them know that you're a Christian? I don't know. How many of them don't know? Or how many of them, if they were asked, is Brian a Christian? They would say, I don't know. How many of them would say that about you in your workplace? So we're worried about our reputations, our popularity, our jobs, worried about promotions. Maybe if I let on that I'm a Christian, maybe I don't get promoted. Worried about our classmates at our school because, you know, the Christians on campus are just real jerks, and, you know, I don't want to be associated with them, or they're nerds or geeks or whatever you call them these days. You know, I don't want my classmates to think badly of me, our coworkers, our family members, and at times really everyone around us. We're just afraid of everyone. Now, at least 4 times in the Scriptures we're told not to be afraid of other people. Psalm 27:1, Psalm 56:11, Psalm 118 verse 6, and Hebrews 13 verse 6, which quotes Psalm 118 verse 6. I don't have to fear man. What can man do to me? What can man do to me? Now that's the context that Jesus gives us here when he says, I'll show you whom you should fear. Look, the worst thing that another human being can do to you is torture you and then kill you. It's the worst thing they can do. Now, that's bad enough. But that ultimately has an end to it. It's not going to last forever. But God is the judge. And God is the one that determines. You've either received Him or you have not. You've either believed in Him or you have not. And if you have not, then He's the one that says, you're out. Now, He's someone to fear. Because not only does He have the power to kill the body, He also has the power to condemn the soul into hell for eternity. That's someone to fear. And yet we do fear people. Even the great patriarch Abraham. You guys remember the story about Abraham traveling to the land that God told him to go to, and as they got to Egypt, his wife, who was a real looker, Sarah, he says to Sarah, look, we're going through a tough neighborhood. If you say to them that you are my wife, they'll kill me and steal you. So tell them you're my sister. Well, that got him into enough trouble. You can read about it in Genesis chapter 12, verses 10 to 20. But what Abraham didn't factor on, and it comes up in verse 17 of Genesis chapter 12, is that while Abraham was trying to figure out how he could avoid this potential situation that was only threatening to him personally, don't worry about you, Sarah, I'm worried about my hide. What he didn't factor in there is that God was watching over him. God was the one that was protecting him. That's what comes up there in verse 17. God was the one that was their defender and their guard. So while he's trying to figure out how to manipulate the situation, God's on the job. While we want to be a good witness to others, we need to pay attention to the impressions that we give people. What's the impression that we're giving to unbelievers around us? Again, like I said, if you've joined us this morning and you don't know the Lord, look at the Christians around you. What's the impression that they've given to you? Have they given you the impression that Christians are people that really believe what they believe and they live it faithfully every single day? Or do you smell and see the hypocrisy in their lives? And don't let that stop you from coming to Christ for salvation. That's their issue, and they'll be judged by God for it. You'll be judged for your acceptance or your rejection of Jesus Christ. Don't let the hypocrites stop you. Remember, for those of us that know God, He has not given us a spirit of fear. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7. He hasn't given us a spirit of fear, so we have no need to be fearful. Well, that's one of the ways that we're fearful or stumble into that kind of fear amongst other people. But then the second is this. Okay, one of our fears is what other people think of us. But here's the other part. What does God think of us? Now there's a more important thought. Ultimately what you think of me or what anybody thinks of me is irrelevant. What's relevant is what does God think of me. Here in verses 8 to 12, the genuineness of our faith is tested in the fire. He says, I say to you, in verse 8, whoever confesses me before men, him the Son of Man also will confess before the angels of God. But then as he gets down into verse 11, he says, now when they bring you to the synagogues and magistrates and authorities, what is that situation? What are we going to be dragged in front of authorities? Is that the situation? Well, that was the situation in the first century. The bottom line is, at some point or the other, we're going to have to give an account of whether we believe or whether we do not believe. So sometimes the test of the genuineness of our faith happens in the fire. So when things are going good, it's easy to be a Christian, right? Easy to be happy-go-lucky, praise the Lord, I'm going to church. Matter of fact, I'm so holy this week, I might even go to Bible study too. That's the impression that we want to give to people. But what's the impression before God, since He sees our hearts? He says, I know why you're doing this. You're just putting on a show. You're putting on a show for other people. God sees that, and you can't fool Him. Now He says, whoever confesses me before men, him the Son of Man will also confess before the angels of God. Another translation, I think it's the NIV, uses the word acknowledge. Acknowledge. That's a good translation of that word. Now, the reality is that when we confess or when we acknowledge that we are Christians to other people, Jesus says that He's in heaven saying, He's one of mine. Did you hear that down there? Did you hear that? Did you hear what Brian just said to that guy or that gal? He's one of mine. He's one of mine. Now, I like that. Now, there's a flip side to that, though. Over in Matthew chapter 7, in verse 23, as a matter of fact, let's back up. Matthew chapter 7, verse 21, for context. Jesus says this. Listen carefully here. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, that's the day of judgment, when you die and when you stand before God, many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name? Who are those people? Who are those people that prophesy